Tonight we begin our study with the 17th chapter of 1 Kings. Now the next few chapters are going to be a little bit different from the earlier chapters because we have been focusing upon the kings as we read about them in both southern Judah and northern Israel. But the next few chapters, the emphasis and the prime people of them are going to be two of the most majestic prophets of whom we read in all the Bible. The one is Elijah, the other is Elisha. Now, of course, these prophets are going to be dealing with the king that happens to be in power at that time. And in the 17th chapter, the king in northern Israel is Ahab. And Elijah was a prophet of God doing his work in the northern kingdom. Now, the chapter begins where Elijah is said to Ahab that it would not rain for 3 years. This was obviously going to produce a very severe drought, wouldn't it? And God often punished his people with hardship of this nature because of their wickedness, and we believe that this was the reason that there's going to be this drought of 3 years. And so he tells Ahab that this is what is going to take place. Now the question is raised, well, how will Elijah get along during this drought? Well, God's going to provide for his own. He's going to send him to a brook, and he will drink from the brook, and he will be fed by ravens. Now, isn't that a wonderful way to be fed? Not that the ravens would be the food, but I believe they'd bring in the groceries. That's the idea that I get anyway. And God is going to provide for him. Well, that went on, obviously, for a time, but the drought was so severe that the brook from which he drank, it dried up. Now, how is God going to provide for his people? And here I think we learn something about these nations, or some of the people in these nations that were exceedingly wicked. There still seemed to be people that had correspondence with God. And even though the nation was wicked, they remained faithful to God. We're going to see more than one tonight in our lesson. But here is a widow down in the country of Zarephath. And Elijah has said, you go down there. I have commanded her to take care of you. So he goes. And when he gets there, he tells the woman that he wants a little cake and so forth. Well, this poor soul, she doesn't hardly have anything. She said, I was just gathering wood to make a little cake for my son and I, and then we would die. Now, that's how desperate the situation had gotten in the land. But Elijah said, now you take care of me first. If you'll fix my cake and if you'll bring me my drink and so forth, why, you need not worry about having plenty of food from here on in till the drought is over. So she did as she was instructed. Of course, this was a miracle of supply. And I emphasize it was a miracle. Her meal, whatever she had here, what was it, what kind of, did she have a meal or something? Whatever it was she was making the cake out of, it's meal. It wasn't going to run out, even though she would use it. Well, now that doesn't ordinarily happen, and that was a miracle. We're going to see, folks, that God uses these prophets to do many miraculous things. Not only Elijah, but especially when we get to Elisha. Elisha's career is just filled with one miracle right after another, but Elijah also. And here's a miracle of supply. Now, tragedy struck her home. Her son fell sick, and Scripture says in verse 17, there was no breath left in him. Well, Elijah told her to bring the son to me, and to abbreviate the story somewhat, he restored the life to the child. But what I want us to emphasize was her reaction to his restoration of this child. Look at verse 24. It tells us of the purpose of miracles. Now by this I know that thou art a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in thy mouth is truth. Elijah could not have done this if it had not been for God, could he? She was convinced of Elijah and his message and that he was a man of God because of what he did, the miracle that he performed. And folks, that's the reason Jesus performed miracles, wasn't it? That's the reason the apostles performed miracles. That's the reason the miracles of the first century in the early church. To prove, to verify, to authenticate, to validate, to show that what they were teaching was of God. And so that was the purpose of this miracle. Not only was it, of course, to benefit the good widow here who had obeyed the commandment of God, but it showed God was with Elijah. Now, this drought continues on. And in the third year, God told Elijah, you go show yourself to Ahab, and I'm going to send rain. The drought is about to come to a close. So he went. Meanwhile, beginning with verse 3 of chapter 18, Ahab had a man named Obadiah that was the governor of his house. Now, I mentioned before, Ahab is probably one of the most unscrupulous individuals that ever put one foot in front of another. And he had a very wicked government. But here was a man named Obadiah. Now, this is not the minor prophet Obadiah that you read about. This man is a servant, and he is in Ahab's government. I find this to be somewhat of a dilemma for Obadiah. How could he remain faithful to God, which he did, in the environment of a wicked, vicious, cruel, devilish government like Ahab had? I don't know about you. I'm hoping and praying that there may be some good men somewhere sometime to fill the governmental positions, but they've got a hard job. Any good man has got a hard job when he is in a corrupt government. Don't you think so? He is so tempted. He is so pressured. So many things are bad round about him. But Obadiah, he had been a good man. Ahab and Obadiah, they divide their search for water. Ahab's going to go one way looking for water. Obadiah's going to go another way looking for water. Well, as Obadiah was searching, Elijah found him. And Elijah said, Obadiah, you go tell Ahab, I want to see him. It's time for us to have a talk. Obadiah didn't take to that, and here's why. They had been searching for Elijah because they wanted to destroy him. And he reasoned with Elijah, said, now if I go and tell Ahab I know where you are, he's going to think I knew where you are all along, and he's just liable to kill me for that. And he said, Elijah, I have saved 100 of God's prophets. I kept them in a cave. I fed them. I've been taking care of them. I've been trying to do what's right. This is a terrible thing you're asking me to do. And said, you just liable to not show up, and then my head will roll. Elijah said, you go get him. I'll be here. So Obadiah goes to Ahab in verse 16, and he told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. I want you to look at verse 17 particularly, folks. It came to pass when Ahab saw Elijah that Ahab said unto him, art thou he that troubleth Israel? Oh, how typical of wrongdoers. When something goes wrong and they are responsible, do you think they take the responsibility? Not on your life. It's your fault. He did it. It's not my fault. You're the troublemaker, Elijah. Elijah, he wasn't a troublemaker. Ahab was the troublemaker. And Elijah didn't let him get away with it either, folks. Notice what he says in verse 18. I have not troubled Israel, but thou and thy father's house, and then he tells him how, in that ye have forsaken the commandments of the Lord, and thou hast followed Balaam. What does this tell us about Elijah? He's bold. He's strong. He's dedicated to do the will of God and to straighten things out. He has no hesitancy to condemn the wicked. He tells the truth. Ahab, you're the trouble, and it's because you and those before you have disobeyed God. That's why there's trouble in Israel. I was just thinking, and it doesn't really tell, how Ahab must have looked on his face when Elijah told him that. I doubt that he was grinning, do you? I doubt that he was even smirking. I sort of got an idea he may have a streak of fear in his brow right about this time. But to the credit of Ahab, Elijah proposes a contest between himself and the 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of the high places and of the idols and of the groves. Ahab was willing for this contest to take place. And he gathers the prophets of Baal together. He gets them all together. Now they come to Mount Carmel, and the people are there. Look at verse 21. If you ever saw a sorry situation, you see it here in verse 21. Look at it. Elijah came unto all the people and said, How long halt ye between two opinions? If the Lord be God, follow him. If Baal be God, follow him. What could be fairer? Isn't that a fair proposition? Let's see who the true God is. Whichever one it is, if it's your God or if it's my God, whichever one it is, let's follow him. Let's get off of this don't know what I'm going to do, indecision sort of a situation. Notice the reaction of the people. The people answered him not a word. They sat there like a bump on a pickle. They didn't have a bit of get up about them at all. They wouldn't even stand up for what they thought was right or wrong. They just sit there. Now, I'll tell you something, folks, and this is a little personal, but I've seen folks like that. You can talk to you blue in the face, and what's their reaction? No, nothing. No, you're just like you're talking to a post. They don't have any reaction. They don't seem to care. And that was the trouble with these people. They didn't seem to care, because if they cared, they'd been doing something about making a decision a long time before now. But the contest is going to take place. What's the contest? Well, Elijah said, now you give each one of us a bullock. We'll set up an altar. We'll get the wood. We'll put the bullock on the altar and so forth. And we'll call upon our God to bring down fire on that altar and on that sacrifice. Well and good. All right, Baal prophets, you can go first. Well, they went first. And they went. And they went. And they went. Morning, noon, afternoon. They kept hollering and dancing and shouting and carrying on like a bunch of wild people, even cutting themselves with their knives like they would do in their heathen, barbaric sort of practices. They didn't get an answer from Baal. Are you surprised? Why, certainly not. Baal's no God. They ought to realize they wasn't going to get anything out of Baal. And Elijah, he ridiculed them. He said, call a little louder. Maybe he's gone somewhere. Call a little louder. Maybe he's talking. Or call a little louder. Maybe he's sleeping. And he just urged them on till they just exhausted themselves in their folly. No fire. Then it was Elijah's turn. And he called on God. God sent down fire. And before he did that, though, I don't want to forget this. He had 12 barrels of water. Now, I don't know where they got it. Evidently, it wasn't a complete washout. 12 barrels of water they poured over his altar and over his sacrifice. Now, why would Elijah want that to be done? That would eliminate any possibility whatsoever for anybody to accuse, though, if any fire took place, that it was of human origin. He had soaked that thing so thoroughly there wasn't a man living that could light a match or even a cigarette lighter and get that thing going. They were completely soaked. If there's going to be any fire, it's going to have to come from God. And so he prayed, and God sent fire, and it consumed the wood, it consumed the sacrifice, it consumed the altar, it consumed the dust around the altar, it consumed the water. Quite decisive, wasn't it? What a contrast between what Elijah called for and what those false prophets had tried to do. Well, to the credit of the people for the moment, they shouted, "The Lord, He is the God. The Lord, He is the God." Now that's what Elijah wanted to accomplish. Wouldn't you say that this was a great victory for Elijah personally? Yes. Wouldn't you say this was even a greater benefit to Israel? No doubt about it. Wasn't this something that would magnify Almighty God? Absolutely. This was a very high point. This was a victorious moment in the history of northern Israel because of what Elijah had done. And with that, Elijah tells Ahab, "Ahab, you better get home, brother. It's going to start raining." I mean, it's going to rain, and if you are not at home, you may not get there. You better scat. And so he did. Now, I want you to notice something. We learned something here. Elijah went up on a hill with his servant. And 7 times he asked the servant to go and look out, and if you see anything, 6 times he didn't see anything. The 7th time he said, "I see a little cloud." And that cloud kept coming. Let me ask you, from whence comes rain? Doesn't it always come from a cloud? Is it a miracle that rain comes from a cloud? No. That's according to the laws of nature that God has set in motion when He created the universe. This wasn't a miracle by the natural affairs of the world. The Lord answered the prayer of Elijah for rain to come. Now, in the New Testament, James teaches us about prayer in the 5th chapter, where he says, "The effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much," James 5:16. And he cites this very event right here as an example of God answering prayer. There are sometimes people who scoff at the idea of prayer. They say, "Oh, you say you don't believe in miracles, but if God didn't perform a miracle, why there wouldn't be any answer of prayer." That's not so. God could do whatever He wants to do, but God doesn't have to perform a miracle to answer prayer. He didn't perform a miracle to answer this prayer. Now, let me hasten to add, I don't know how much God is behind the scenes of nature to make things happen. This has to do with the realm of the providence of God. I know the providence of God is true because the Bible teaches it. We have examples of it. Just exactly to what extent God uses even angels to provide for our welfare. The book of Hebrews teaches that angels are helping us. I don't know how or to what extent. It's not miraculous. The days of miraculous have already accomplished their purposes and they're not there. God answers prayer nonetheless, and He can do it by natural means. Now, He may be manipulating those natural means in some way as far as I know. And if that's the way He wants to do it, boy, listen, that suits me. Anything he wants to do suits me. But it doesn't have to be a miracle. That's the point I want to make. Now, does anybody have any comment or question or anything you want to make on these two chapters so far, 17 and 18? Now, I know we're moving pretty swiftly, but if we get through before Christmas, we got to do it.
Sounds like in verse 46, Elijah outran Ahab in his chariot.
Yeah. I just wonder if Elijah might have been a little skeptical that the drought was going to be over, but he now knows it. And God has handled this thing, hasn't he? Now, as we go into the 19th chapter, as I mentioned a moment ago, as an introduction to this chapter now, that contest, that was a majestic moment of victory for God and his people. But look how things change for Elijah. Ahab told Jezebel what had happened. Jezebel sent him a message. Verse 2. So let the gods do so to me and more also, if I make not thy life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. You see, after the contest, Elijah said, kill those 450 prophets. They did. Jezebel, oh boy, she's a doll. Jezebel said, by this time tomorrow, that's what's going to happen to you, Elijah. Well, Elijah's a pretty smart man. He makes tracks. He gets out of there. He goes down to Judah, and you find Elijah under a juniper tree. And he's resting under that juniper tree, and the Lord comes to him, an angel does, and provides for him food, and he says, arise and eat. And he did. And he moved on from that place on out into the wilderness, where he stayed for some 40 days and 40 nights, and in a cave. And this is not exactly where you would expect to find a victorious prophet, is it? He had just won the hearts of the people, it seems. But the threatenings of Jezebel caused him to flee, and when he was there in that cave, he was so discouraged. He was discouraged under the juniper tree. He was discouraged in the cave. Have you ever been discouraged? There's a story told about Brother Tom Holland, I think, that he was asked one time, do preachers ever get discouraged? He says, yes. He said, do you ever get discouraged so much they want to quit? Have you ever gotten so discouraged you want to quit? He said, well, not this week. I'll tell you what will discourage a preacher, and I know because I've tried to preach, and that is to work hard and to work up a lesson and try to get it to present to people, and you've got it ready for Sunday night, and half the congregation doesn't even care because they don't show up. Now, that's not the way it is here, but it is where I go. They don't even care enough to support the preaching of the gospel. That's discouraging. But you don't let that bother you. You're so thankful for the ones that are there, you go ahead and preach just the same. Elijah was discouraged. He was under the juniper tree. The Lord comes to him and said, Elijah, what you doing here? He said, oh, I've been zealous for your way, verse 19, for your covenant. I've thrown down their altars, their prophets. I've done everything I could. And we find out that he thought he was the only one in Israel that even cared. The Lord tells him over in verse 19, there's 7,000 that hadn't bowed the knee to Baal. You know, I like to think that there's probably more faithful brethren than I'm aware of, and I'm grateful for every single one that I know. But there were 7,000, the Lord told him, that hadn't bowed their knee to Baal. And so he tells Elijah, I'm going to get rid of this discouragement. And how does he do it? He does it, folks, now let's get this, in a way that has always worked. When you're discouraged, get back to work. That's the way to get over discouragement. He tells Elijah now down here in verse 15, I want you to go, and I don't know how much influence Elijah had in Syria, which was the arch enemy of Israel, but I want you to go up to Syria, where Ben-Hadad was king. We'll read about him a little bit later. And anoint a man named Hazael to be the next king. And I want you to go over here further, and I want you to anoint, in verse 16, a man named Jehu, who will be king in Israel. Not necessarily the next king, but he will be the king in Israel. If you look on your chart just a dab. You see Ahab up there under Omri and Ahab, and you've got a couple of fellas in between, and then you got Jehu. Jehu is going to become king. And we'll read about how he becomes king. And it's just most tantalizing as to how Jehu becomes king and what he does in taking over the throne. But he said, I want you to go, and furthermore, I want you to go and get your successor, Elisha. Elisha is going to take Elijah's place as God's prophet after a while. And so we read in the last verse of verse 21, Elisha arose and went after Elijah. He travels with Elijah for a while. And then when we come to chapter 20, I don't know that we'll get through 20, but I mentioned Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria. He came and warred against Samaria. Now, Samaria, you see in verse 1, Samaria is the capital of northern Israel. So he's waging war against northern Israel at a time when Ahab is still king. And verse 2 says he sent messengers to Ahab, and his message was a demand. I want your silver, I want your gold, I want your wives, I want your children, I want everything good that you've got. And Ahab was giving in to it. And Ben-Hadad came along and even demanded a little more. Says, I'm going to send some men down there to your country, and they can take anything they want. Well, the elders of Israel advised Ahab, says, look, he's demanding too much. You tell him, no go. And he sent word back to Ben-Hadad, I'm not going to do that. Well, Ben-Hadad said in verse 10, the gods do so to me and more also, if the dust of Samaria shall suffice for handfuls for all the people that follow me. I'm going to completely destroy you. And, you know, Ahab, he reminds me of some of my light bulbs. I'll turn it on and they'll go pew, and go out. But it'll have just a flicker of something you like. I liked Ahab willing to have the contest. That was pretty good. But here you really like what he had to say to Ben-Hadad. Ben-Hadad said, I'm going to come down there and mop up with you. And here's what Elijah told him in verse 11. Let not him that girdeth on his harness boast himself as he that putteth it off. What's he saying? Ben-Hadad, don't count your chickens before the hatch, brother. You hadn't won this thing yet. You think you're going to just mop up with me. You just wait. You know, I get amused sometimes at all these big 300-pound football players in the football league. And before a game, they'll shoot off their mouth about what they're going to do and how they're going to mop up somebody and they're going to crush that quarterback and they'll make him wish he had never woke up and all that sort of thing. And then after the game, they got the tar beat out of them. They don't say so much. Let not him boast that goes into the battle like the man that wins the battle. And so Ahab is facing Ben-Hadad. We're going to stop right here now, I believe, aren't we?
Yes, sir.
I can't see that clock, but you can.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. And we're going to stop here. we're going to see that Ahab faces a great host of Syrians, and he doesn't know how he's going to handle this. But God shows him how to handle it. And folks, he handles it. But you'll have to wait till next week to find out how. Okay. Thank you.